All right, great. First, and thanks for being here. This Ideas Festival is fantastic. This is, I think, my 5th or 6th year here, and it's just a wonderful way to get to know a lot of knowledge, a lot of people, a lot of information. But what we want to talk about today is the title of this, After COVID, Preventing the Next Pandemic. And what they want us to do is try and answer this question. Obviously, we're not going to fully answer it, but get as close as we can. Now that the world has watched the theoretical risk become real, the COVID pandemic, can we learn lessons and do better before the next theoretical, inevitable threat arrives? So can we do that? We want to go ahead and use the panel here of experts, and these are definitely the experts here to help us out. To my left, Dr. Neil Vora. He is a policy fellow at Conservation International and an adjunct professor of internal medicine and infectious disease at Columbia University. Thank you, Neil, for being here. Dr. Ann Pritchett. She is the Senior Vice President of Policy and Research at the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, Pharma. And Dr. Victor Zhao, a good friend of mine, the President of the National Academy of Medicine. So thank you guys for being here with us today. And Victor, let's start with you because we want to get that broad overview of what's happening here. Give us a broad overview of the issues going on right now and looking forward to the next pandemic.
John, it's great to be here. Great with Aspen, in person, seeing all of you after 2.5 years, or 3 years, right? So it's wonderful. By the way, you say after COVID. We still have COVID.
We do.
So we got to go over it, get over it first. But I would take your challenge to talk about, what is this about prevention? So let me frame up the issue for the rest of the panel. And maybe about 5 minutes.
Sure.
So we do know that the last 2.5 years has been devastating in so many different ways. I mean, can you imagine 540 million cases in the world with 6.3 million deaths? And in this country, it's hard to imagine, 1 million deaths with 88 million infected. That's really amazing. But also, it's impacted us in so many different ways. The economic impact is huge. I think we lost about $8.5 trillion, 4% GDP drop in 2 years. And of course, we know it disrupts education, it increases mental health problems, and so on and so forth. So it is really not just a global health crisis. It's a security crisis, economic crisis, you name it. So that's why we need to take this very seriously. Now, so how do I see this? As you said, for a while, people say this is going to come. We had SARS, H1N1, Ebola. I remember about all the work we did after Ebola saying we got to prepare. And people say the world lives in a cycle of panic and neglect. After it's all gone, we're going to go start all over again. So we can't let this happen again. No question, COVID showed that we're unprepared. And in fact, I believe it's a collective failure of everyone in the world, not prepare for us and not be able to respond effectively. So I'd like to say quickly about what happened in the U.S. and globally, because you asked me to do that as well, and then what can we do in the future? Well, you all lived this COVID in U.S., so I don't need to tell you what you know. You probably know more than I do with regards to problem with testing, and by the time we didn't have enough testing in the beginning, by the time we have enough, there's access problem, and of course, public health was a real problem. I think pandemic COVID-19 showed the weakness of public health system. We're highly fragmented. You probably don't know this. CDC, of course, is a federal, Center for Disease Control, but there are 3,000 departments of health in states, in local cities, and you name it. So the lack of coordination is a significant problem. Being able to respond together, having the coordination and leadership. Second is under-resourcing. I'm sure you all read that at the early part of the pandemic, CDC was using fax machines to communicate. I don't even know what fax machines anymore. I don't think I can find one. And of course, lack of workforce. Tremendous shortage of workforce. So one thing we certainly learned would be this has got to change. But also we saw politicization of CDC and public health. And that's certainly not helping in any way. Eroded public trust in our own system. And of course, vaccine. As John said, This is great news because it's one of our successes. And yet, think about this, we still have lots of people not vaccinated, right? We have vaccinated about 215 million, but there are many others with vaccine hesitancy. But even the rollout took us forever to happen. And of course, I think the lessons we learned is the inequity that we see, which is certainly aggravated. Communities of color, the elderly, people who live in, low economic communities, people who have to work in front line, were a lot more exposed and a lot of deaths in this area. I think we finally own up to a point that our system is really not equitable. I think the biggest lesson I learned is trust. And I'm sure all of you know this, right? What's happened to us is despite all the technological successes, when it all came, I think the community was just not ready to function together because of the concern of trust. Messaging, communication, and of course, misinformation. So now we're in much better shape. We're all together, wonderful, but we're not out of the woods yet. You all know about Omicron, BA2. Well, guess what? There's BA4 and 5. Not here yet, but certainly we're still concerned about this. So there's a lot of work to be done. Globally, I think this picture is even more stark in the sense there's lack of coordination. WHO is an emergency response, but there's nobody coordinating all the different countries, all the actors together. And so how do you respond to who's going to do manufacturing, who's going to do procurement, whole bit. And so what really happened is the world got together to form Accelerator, COVAX. I'm sure you heard about this. I'm part of that organization or entity, being one of the early participants in the principal steering committee. And we worked really hard to think about what's an equitable way to have vaccines and testing diagnostic equitably globally. Well, when you didn't have enough, the supply was insufficient. There was vaccine nationalism. And as you know, every rich country bought up the vaccines first to protect the citizen like us, but leaving very little. In fact, India had a ban on export ban. So you can't even get vaccines out from Serum Institute of India. So that, I think, unmasked tremendous problem. And now that we have enough capacity, delivery is still a problem. Only about 80% of low-income country population is vaccinated, whereas the world's population, about 70%, 60-some%. So I think we also learned a lot about, what happens globally. And so the question we need to ask ourselves is, what's next? What do we do? First, let me say that I don't think COVID is a black swan event. I think most of us predict it will happen again. We don't know when, but 2019, I serve on the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, and we have said, what happens if you have respiratory virus, not Ebola? And what happens is highly infectious. And guess what? A year later, we have this happen. I think we just have to wake up this time and get much better ready. So I would say there are 5 things that we need to do to get ready, right? It has to be the whole puzzle, not pieces of a puzzle. First, surveillance, right? Be able to early testing, early diagnosis, surveillance, data communication, and being able to monitor and track and go forward. Public health systems. We talk about how important that is. Health systems, where there's not enough PPE, ICU, you name it, we need to strengthen those health systems. And of course, countermeasures, diagnostic, vaccine, and testing. And finally, trust in community and community engagement. So let me just finish by telling you what U.S. is doing. September 2021, U.S. released a plan called American Pandemic Plan, or AP3 we call it, American Pandemic Preparedness Plan. It has those 5 elements of looking at what to do. But let me highlight just a few. One is massively investing in CDC. So, for example, not only more infrastructure, employing more workers, but also they have realized that data is a big problem. And I'm sure that Neil's going to talk about this. It's so fragmented that people have pieces of data and not pulled together, and early warning. So they are going to go in a data modernization effort. They have established a center for forecasting and outbreak analytics. Really important to know what to expect when you begin to have an outbreak. There is now a review of CDC itself, but also yesterday, the Commonwealth Fund released a report on redoing the national public health system altogether. We can talk about that a little bit. I think in the areas of vaccine, you heard about vaccination. What people are doing is now looking at the 25 viral families and do what they call prototype pathogen. So if you study one of the members of the family, just like we had coronavirus, you will have a vaccine ready to be adaptable to other members, SARS-CoV-1, SARS-CoV-2. That's how fast mRNA was able to do this. And of course, tests and therapeutics. I think that we need to learn to communicate, to gain trust, to engage the community, because if we don't do that, we won't be ready. Final point about globally. Globally, there's a lot of work needs to be done. Everybody recognizes that we need to come together solidarity, and of course, investing in surveillance, because many countries don't even have laboratory facilities and testing and genomic surveillance, so we need to do that. You're going to talk about One Health, right? That's really important. And of course, public health system and trained workforce. There's not enough skilled workforce globally in public health and others to do this. I think that ACT Accelerator, which brought together CEPI, Gavi, Global Fund, need to be permanent so that we always have this architecture there to work together, and not separately. And then there is an initiative in G7 called the 100-Day Mission, which says that we're now going to go forward, US, UK, and other countries, to say once you got the declaration of an emergency, within 100 days, we'll have tests, we'll have vaccine therapeutics ready to go into manufacturing. So that's going to be much faster, because it took us about a year this time. But that requires a lot of changes. And finally, to do all this, you need distributed manufacturing. The manufacturing were concentrated, still are, although better, mainly in countries which are richer, have more resources. So many countries have to wait till their turn. So there's a push towards let's have manufacturing in a regional fashion. And I co-chair the World Economic Forum on this initiative. We need money. To do this, financing is it, right? And the G20 high-level panel, which I served on, asked for $10 billion a year over 5 years. There's a study that showed that if you invest $1, you mitigate and avert $1,000 of economic loss. So the issue is so obvious, and yet we have great difficulty getting the funding that's needed. To the credit of this administration, there was a major meeting in May, which now 4 countries have pledged $1 billion. That's US, European Union, Germany, and the Wellcome Trust. And now Indonesia and others are joining. So now the creation of this fund, which will be hosted at the World Bank, will beginning the whole idea of how do we actually use this money for global public good. My last point is that, of course, you have to say who's going to make the decision, who's going to spend the money, how's going to spend it. So you have to create an inclusive mechanism to govern this. And I think it's really important for low-income countries to have a seat at the table. I think what we learned repeatedly is that the global north, G7, G20, dictates all those things, thinking we're doing good. But the poor country is saying, wait a minute, we don't want this. We want to be part of the solution. We want to tell you what we need. So this money has to be spent, in my opinion, in countries and regions to solve the problem. Thank you.
And Victor, you bring a great point up, and I think everybody here can tell from your overview here that there are a lot of issues here. There are a lot of things to look at going forward, and some of these lessons I think we learned moving into this pandemic. Some of them I think we forgot. In my own training in the military, we always said, it's not if, it's when, and we're going to forget these things moving forward. And you bring up a lot of good points there, but we're not going to be able to eat the whole pie. We can only nibble at little things and get things done continuously, and hopefully by the time we get to that point, we're ready this time, not like we were last time. But Anne, one of the things we had talked about before this program is you brought up what one of the biggest issues going on here was misinformation and mistrust in that information. How do we fix that going forward?
I think that's a really tough question to answer. What I would say, though, is that this distrust in science didn't just happen with the prior administration. This has been a long-standing issue. It certainly has been exacerbated.
Did social media make it worse?
I think certainly, and around the globe, it's made it worse. That's, as you pointed out, the country readiness issues we face around the globe. We have vaccines that countries are turning away, in part because of concentrated disinformation and misinformation efforts. And we've certainly seen that in the U.S., and now we're seeing it play out around the globe. So I think, to Victor's point, we have to do more to reinforce the science. Our companies have been very transparent in terms of, here's what it takes to bring a vaccine forward, here are the studies, here's the data, and I think we've seen FDA be more transparent in terms of the emergency authorizations of these products, and I think that's really important, being transparent. But I think a large part of it is kind of a long-standing public health issue, that people believe messages that they're hearing from people in their communities, people that they relate to. So just having, kind of talking heads saying everyone should get vaccinated and, you should just do it because it's the right thing to do, that's not how we actually get people vaccinated. That's not how we get people to get their healthcare screenings done. So I think in a way we have to go back to basics, and we have to really look at and reinforce our scientific institutions. And we need them to be transparent, and we need to avoid kind of a patchwork of messaging. We've had states that were giving messages counter to what our federal officials have been saying. We've had different federal agencies giving conflicting messages. So, we really have to do a better job collectively, and we've got to kind of build that workforce of tomorrow, which, look at how many healthcare workers have left the field during this pandemic that have been at the brunt of getting beaten up and criticized and, their lives threatened. Not just verbally, but physically. Yeah. And we've got to rebuild trust in that workforce. I mean, these are the people that are essential, that gave above and beyond during this crisis, and they've been treated horribly, and I can see why a lot have left. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but we've got to start at the basics with making some of those infrastructure investments, identifying the community leaders, and people want to hear from people they can relate to. They don't want to hear from a talking head in Washington, frankly. They want to hear from, their pastor, their, person in their community.
The people they trust.
Yeah.
Is it getting that information out there, or is it winning the PR battle that's important? Or a combination of the two?
I think it's a combination of the two.
Because without the PR battle, that misinformation gets out there through social media. That misinformation gets out there through various channels in the media itself. So without that battle being won, that could be difficult.
Yes. And I think all of us know people that we have family members, we have friends that, they read something online and they think it's true. I mean, I think all of us have probably spent a lot of time trying to point people to reputable sources, and that's part of it too. We need to kind of retrain people or train people. Like, here's how you assess the verity of a source that you're looking at.
And Neil, Victor brought up information, data, those types of process. How important is that going forward, making sure that the information is accurate? Because we kept getting information fed to us in various ways, and sometimes they didn't always agree.
Absolutely agree with all of Victor's remarks about the importance of data and surveillance. I worked for the CDC for nearly a decade. I ran New York City's COVID contact tracing program, and the backbone of everything that public health agencies from the local level all the way to the CDC does, the backbone is surveillance. You need good surveillance so you understand how certain diseases are occurring in a population, and then you can detect those aberrations so that you can act upon it quickly. We need to be able to quickly identify threats when they occur, because the next threat is only a plane ride away, right? I can be in one part of the world and within hours be on the other side of the planet carrying any pathogen that I've become infected with along with me. So we have to detect these things quickly. That means good diagnostics. Then we need good outbreak response around that, good contact tracing in many instances, and we need access to good health care. People need health care so that they can survive from these infections, so that they have trust in the system going forward.
But Neil, wouldn't you say that we had a lot of instances where states didn't have the infrastructure or were actively in some ways dissuading people from getting tested and reporting, and that we've got some fundamental kind of data gaps? Certainly on the health equity side, we saw that states, some are collecting that information, some aren't. So it's kind of hard to have lessons learned when we don't have the full data picture to inform it. So I think, to Victor's point, we need to treat that data infrastructure as critical infrastructure.
Well,
global health, security, all very integrally linked.
I mean, people are collecting data, but there's lots of missing data as well, but they're not necessarily integrated. So, for example, I was CEO at Duke Health System. We collect a lot of information. We do a lot of things. Earlier on, I was talking to Donna Shalay. She pointed out, well, public health need to be connected with the hospital and health systems. That's another one. And, of course, we collect data which are insufficient. I'm Asian American. I can tell you we are invisible in the data collection with regards to the impact on us, et cetera. So there's a lot of missing pieces. I think in going forward, we really have to look at entire data infrastructure and to be able to coordinate and align all the data.
And Neil, one of the things that you and I talked about that you bring up is this communication, getting the data out there, getting all these parts out there to make sure that we're ready for the next pandemic is important, but at the same time understanding how pandemics happen and trying to make sure these outbreaks don't occur and preventing that spillover. How important is that, making sure that we put the resources in for that?
So a little background here is really helpful. We know very clearly that infectious diseases have increasingly emerged since at least the 1940s. And so I'm going to refer to those as emerging infectious diseases. And the pathogens that cause most emerging infectious diseases originate from animals, particularly wildlife, and then spill over into people. So these pathogens are jumping species. And these are not random, isolated events. These are often high-consequence events. Everything from HIV to Ebola to monkeypox, and probably also COVID, originated because of that spillover of wildlife pathogens into people. And the reason why these are increasingly occurring are because of human activities that place us in more and more contact with wildlife, largely related to deforestation, so cutting down tropical forests and subtropical forests, wildlife trade, and raising farmed animals in unsafe conditions. So I did say that these emerging infectious diseases are on the rise. We have all experienced that, sadly, over the last 2.5 years. But there's also a reason for hope here, because we understand why emerging infectious diseases increasingly occur. So now we need to start working upstream to prevent that emergence in the first place, right? So preventing outbreaks from occurring. And this is an issue of equity, right? When we prevent outbreaks in the first place, we are saving lives in some of the most remote regions of the world. And these regions often do not have access to the vaccines and the therapeutics that we have access to here in the United States.
One of the things you also brought up is looking at it once it jumps to humans, and which is what happens often, it jumps to humans, trying to slow down that human-to-human transmission. How do we do that moving forward? And do animals take a part in that as well, or is that purely looking at just humans themselves?
So Victor and Ann have brought up a lot of great points about, in the future, when spillover events happen, there is a risk then some pathogens can be spread from human to human, and that's what then creates an outbreak growing into an epidemic and then onward into a pandemic. But there's also another risk here. If we don't think about how we are interacting with animals and nature and fixing this broken relationship that we have with nature, we are going to increasingly suffer from outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics. And one example I'll give you is called spillbacks. Now, I've already talked about spillover, where animal pathogens are jumping over into people. But once these zoonotic pathogens are in people, they can jump back into animals, develop mutations, and then spill over again into people. That puts us at more risk. And we're already talking about this having occurred, at least that spillback, with the virus that causes COVID with deers across the United States, and also with a threat with monkeypox virus. Some of you might have heard about this ongoing outbreak of monkeypox virus, very much in parts of Africa, Europe, and also North America. But there is a risk now that monkeypox virus that's circulating in Europe and in North America among humans might spill back into animals in North America and Europe, such as squirrels. And so we're all interconnected is the point.
So this sets up a cycle.
Exactly.
Victor?
I was going to say, I totally agree with Neil. One Health is, we don't talk enough about this, but One Health is more than just zoonosis, that is animal to human or human to animal. It's actually about agriculture. You talk about forestation. So there's large initiatives going on in the world on One Health. But I think we need to invest a lot more and understand this, because that's the way to really upstream prevent these events. On the surveillance side, there is this thing called syndromic surveillance. That is, you look for clusters. So it's one case, you don't know what you're dealing with, but you see a cluster of few cases, monkeypox. You immediately sound the alarm to say, and that's how you can interrupt this very early.
And one of the things that surprised me a bit is when we were talking, is you had talked about how there was an unprecedented level of collaboration occurring during the pandemic, which is a great thing, that people who before hadn't collaborated. But one of the things that taught us, too, was that last mile was extremely important. Explain that.
Yeah, so one thing I would just note, the success of collaboration can't be underestimated or, underappreciated here, and that we saw within a very short period of time, all companies across the biopharmaceutical industry collaborating, looking at their compound libraries, looking at products previously proved, products that failed, to get as many shots on goal as possible, because usually it's 10 to 15 years before we get a drug approved and only a 12% chance of approval. So we needed as many shots on goals as possible. And companies that were competitors said, hey, if my shot on goal doesn't work, let's work together on manufacturing capacity, which is what allowed us to deliver 13 billion doses around the globe, and by the end of the year, enough to vaccinate everyone who wants a vaccine. But it's everyone who wants a vaccine that's the challenge, right? What we've seen, there is a big disparity between the number of people vaccinated in the U.S. versus the number of people vaccinated in Africa. And a large part of that are these country readiness issues or last mile distribution issues. And I think last mile distribution almost, kind of downplays all of the issues there. It's the same kind of issues we've had in the U.S. Not enough trained healthcare workers, not enough community leaders that are helping address the misinformation and disinformation and trying to educate and encourage people to get vaccinated. Not enough cold storage for these, mRNA vaccines that have special handling requirements. Not enough boots on the ground to help us get, vaccine off a flight and then where they need to go. And then, of course, all of that created supply chain constraints because we've never had a need for so many vaccine supplies as we've seen. And it impacted other areas of therapy. And so, these are all things that we need to address. And they're not new. They're long-standing. I think that's what's some of our collective frustration is that we've seen these when we've seen other crises and outbreaks, and we haven't had the will to address them. But I think what I'm hoping is that now that there seems to be a bigger recognition that these aren't just public health challenges, they're global security challenges, that we need to be making investments in critical infrastructure, not just in the U.S., but around the globe.
Victor?
Well, my feeling is there are good examples of good collaboration, and there are bad examples of competition. It's not all the way that Anne characterized it. So let's begin. I would say the last administration did well with Operation Warp Speed and others because they're willing to put money to companies to say, you have a vaccine, we don't know if it works, but let's manufacturing anyway, called risk manufacturing. That requires taxpayer money, along with companies, with the exception of Pfizer, to actually help them de-risk their application.
So it's a bit of a gamble.
So to me, that's a good public-private partnership. But you heard me mention vaccine nationalism. When there was enough vaccine, even though now there's enough, there was a long period where we've lost a lot of lives of people not being vaccinated because it never got down to poor countries. So the organization I told you about, ACT Accelerator, brings together the pieces, CEPI, who is a vaccine, right, R&D, Gavi, which is Vaccine Alliance, to procure vaccine, and then there's Global Fund. We all work together, try to push forward, and yet not enough money. And I think that, there's a lot of nationalism which prevented it getting to people. So Anne is right, there's a last mile, but I'll say 2 miles ago, we can do much better, right? That's why a lot of people argue that manufacturing should not be concentrated in only a few places or only a few, large companies. It should be distributed regionally in Africa, in South Asia, and places like that, so that when you need it, you don't have to depend on a few manufacturer that you can get them.
Well, that is the approach that's being taken now. Of course, remember that with these mRNA vaccines, there's not that global manufacturing capacity. So companies have had to find partners that have the capabilities to be able to produce those technologies. We've also had the challenge of, while the FDA in both administrations has been side by side with industry to say, what's the information, the guidance you need, how can we get your data quickly so that we can review it in a timely manner. Other countries, regulatory bodies, have not treated the review of therapeutics, diagnostics, and vaccines with the same urgency. So we've kind of got a lot of disconnects that we need to address. But that has been the strategy of the current administration, which is looking at how through multilateral, bilateral engagement can we build more regional capacity. I think the wrong way would be if every country says we need our own standalone manufacturing capacity, because that's just not going to be feasible.
Not every country, regions.
Oh, that's what I'm saying. That's why I think regional is the way to go. There are some that say that's not sufficient, and I would say, we do need to be strategic about where that's placed and make sure that we're going to have the sufficient raw materials, training of those people, have the regulatory bodies that are equipped to review these products as well.
And
so we're not disagreeing. We're just slight flavors of the same issues.
And for any of you, one of the big issues was the global cooperation. That at first, the beginning part of the pandemic seemed pretty robust, and then it started getting into the nationalization you were talking about for a variety of different things, whether it be the vaccines, the therapeutics, the contact tracing, the ecological issues, the conservation. All those ended up turning into more of the nationalization type issues. Moving forward, how do we get that to work? How do we get that to not occur? Because people were looking at the World Health Organization. You could almost say it's kind of a toothless organization. It's great at getting out information, but it doesn't really have any power behind it, and that's just the way it's set up. How do we change that moving forward?
There are many conversations going on. In fact, G7 is meeting and clearly talking about the global health architecture, right? G20. And other, WHO, World Health Assembly. So I think what we need to do is come together, agree on an architecture that works, that's coordinated, that's ready to go.
You think that'll ever happen, though?
Let's put it this way, I'm not pessimistic.
Okay. How about you two?
But let's make sure that we talk about the United States,
yeah.
Right? Because there's a lot of stuff that's needed for this audience that we need to go doing forward. Please.
Yeah,
Neil Ann?
I think that I always like to be cautiously optimistic. I think there's low-hanging fruit where we can establish more lines of collaboration, because I do feel that as the pandemic continues, there is the recognition that we kind of need to lift all boats, so to speak, and that if we make small changes that are increasing the collaboration and cooperation, that can have big payoffs, particularly in the areas that Neil mentioned. I think there's a lot of opportunity. It wouldn't take much to do better.
It would not take much to do better. I totally agree.
I like that.
And there's a convergence of at least 3 existential threats right now, at least which is the focus of my work, which is we're talking about pandemics right now, but number 2 is climate change, which is probably the greatest health threat in the 21st century that the world faces. And number 3 is the loss of biodiversity, which does not get nearly as much attention as those other 2 threats, but we are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction. And our health as humans depends on the health of the animals and other organisms with which we share this planet. And so there are the solutions that I have been suggesting about preventing pandemics, such as stopping deforestation, is also a solution to help fight climate change and fight against the loss of biodiversity. So we need to start thinking about where we can find win-win-wins and invest in common solutions to make each dollar we spend go further. And many of the solutions to address pandemics, climate change, and biodiversity loss will also help to improve equity and poverty in many regions of the world.
I think the one thing you mentioned was funds. Oh, sorry, and I agree with that too. Is the funding that I feel, we have a Congress that doesn't want to approve additional funding to respond to the current crisis. So I'm worried that we're going to lose our window.
Well, you brought up a great point, because we had a conversation before this, and I said, looking forward, funding is going to be an important issue. And you said, no, John, funding is still an important issue today.
It is an issue now.
Yeah. We need to end the pandemic, this one. And there's a long way to go with regards to funding, because Congress has not approved the funding. And as we go towards the fall, we're going to run out of money for therapeutics, for example, and vaccine, et cetera. And then there's a global issue, as I talked about, a lot more resources. So the real, when you think about this, you kind of wonder why not, right? I mean, after all, if you look at the economic impact, it makes sense that you should do this. But I think that people are just not willing to spend money preparing for things that may not happen in the future. And when it happens, you're sorry you didn't prepare for it.
I'm going to open it up in a few minutes for audience questions, so we'll get to you in just a minute. But one of the things I noticed, and I frequently talk about, is that we have very short memories. And so after the pandemic, for a few years, we're like, let's fund things, let's get things moving. And then that money is just sitting there. And I always tell people, I'm not getting paid for what I'm doing. I'm getting paid for what I could do if there is a pandemic that shows up or something like that. They see it the same way, so they start taking the money away. You don't need as much. I can use that for something else. How do we stop that from happening? You guys are the experts.
We need a collective call to action. I think that people need to understand the interconnectedness of these issues. It's not just a pandemic. It's something that impacts people's daily lives. It impacts our economies. I think we just have to do a better job of explaining the building blocks and making the case. And I would note one thing we haven't talked about is kind of superbugs and antimicrobial resistance, where 1 in 7 people hospitalized with COVID have a resistant infection. And that's something that has been a global threat for as long as, for 15, 20 years, even longer. And we don't have the political will to address that, and that should be part of the discussion on pandemic.
It almost sounds like the three of you are saying public health should be a priority.
Yes.
Victor?
I was going to say, indeed, people hold the purse. Countries like Minister of Finance. I think that what we're able to do is to draw them into discussion. And there's a joint task force at G20. And so finally, with that kind of understanding, there is, in fact, more response and investment. Still not enough. I think for this country, we need to really make sure that we, in fact, educate Congress and how important this is for the good of public health.
Great.
And Ann and Victor both touched on this. To build upon that, we have a window of opportunity right now to implement changes to the global architecture for pandemics, and we can't miss this opportunity. There are 3 major policy moments right now from a pandemic prevention perspective. So number one, and this is something that the G20 has been discussing, creating a global fund for pandemics, probably out of the World Bank. This is needed so that we have the resources that the world can use to invest in prevention and preparedness. Number 2 is the World Health Assembly, the governing body of the World Health Organization, is currently negotiating a pandemic agreement, and that will help us fix the failures that the past 2.5 years have exposed in the global architecture around pandemics. And number 3 might sound a surprise, but it's the Convention on Biological Diversity. Right now, the CBD, which is an arm of the UN, is discussing a framework that will set the agenda for saving the world's biodiversity for the next decade, and it is imperative that this framework include measures to prevent pathogen spillover going forward.
Great. And I know you guys have a lot of questions. Let's go ahead and, sir.
I'm Jacob Haka from the University of Southern California. I'm curious, we had enormous success with the vaccine development, but it still took about a year to get to the trial results and then another year to get the vaccine to people's arms. Is there a way to be even faster? I know the founders of BioNTech, they said they could develop the vaccine. They had the code for the vaccine within 48 hours, but it still took 12 months to get it finished. So I'm curious if we can expedite vaccines and therapeutics.
Well, I mentioned earlier, there's a global effort, certainly U.S. and many others, what they call 100-day mission. Together, led by UK and now others, to look at how to begin to speed this up. And it has 25 recommendations, requires a lot of people together. But the bottom line in vaccine is that I said prototype pathogen. There are only 25 viral families. So if you take one prototype from each family and make a vaccine now, you have something ready to go that may not be exactly what you need because you don't know which is going to emerge, but you already have the basis for much faster move, right? So you're quite right. I mean, the sequence was known, and literally within 69 days, vaccine was made to us going into, testing. But, clinical trials also take a long time, and regulation takes a long time. So I think the other thing we need to do is to try to see whether we can redesign clinical trial to make it easier, not all randomized control. You can use, antibody markers, you name it. Safety, of course, is a big issue. Everybody's concerned about this, and you can shortcut that issue. And then finally, the regulation. I would say credit goes to, in fact, FDA and others having this thing called emergency authorization, not approval, because of crisis, they're able to use that mechanism to move much faster. But you need to harmonize across the world, different countries, to move things much faster. So I guess my answer to you is people are really working on this. We get it.
But I would say what happened in this crisis is that the use of real-world data has been invaluable in kind of speeding up the safety data, and that's why we already have pediatric emergency use authorization. So that's unprecedented, the idea that we got a vaccine in this amount, multiple vaccines in this amount of time. So we are looking at kind of the lessons learned with FDA, how we were able to use digital technology so that we can continue clinical trials despite shutdowns, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of lessons learned on the regulatory side that are going to help us just keep improving and building on this model.
You may not be aware that dexamethasone, remdesivir, many of these came from one big trial unit called Recovery, right? That uses this kind of database approach to find who's eligible as you get admitted to the hospital. This is mainly based in UK. They have a single system with single electronic health record, so they can say, aha, this patient fits. We'll just recruit them, and then they can follow their outcome through their clinical data. In our country, we're going to have to find that patient one by one, recruit them, sign consent, and then enter them in trial. So I think there's lots of good ways to move things faster.
Yeah, weirdly, even the ability to have decentralized approval for people to consent to trials, that saved us a lot of time. So sometimes it's the little things, too.
All right. Sir? You.
He's supposed to follow.
Could one of you please comment about the anti-vax movement in the United States? Is there any truth to any of the things that they're saying? And could that particular segment of the population be contributing to the fact that the virus hasn't been abolished in the United States?
I was looking for Peter Hotez, who's in this audience.
He's here somewhere.
Peter, where are you?
Yeah.
Peter, speak up.
If you can get him a mic, that'd be great. Hey, Peter, how are you doing?
It's great to see you, John. It's good to see you in 3 dimensions. It's good to see
Not just virtually.
It's good to see anybody in 3 dimensions.
Peter, introduce yourself. I know you're a celebrity on television, but still.
I'm a professor at Peter Hotez, a professor at Baylor College of Medicine, where I'm also a co-director of the Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development. We make vaccines for COVID-19, but the other hat I wear is I have a daughter, 4 adult kids, including Rachel, has autism and intellectual disabilities, and then about a few years ago I wrote a book called Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, which made me public enemy number 1 or 2 with the anti-vaccine groups. RFK Jr. on his Instagram calls me the OG villain, which I had to look up, the original gangster villain. So by default, I became an expert in anti-vaccine disinformation. It's really come off the wheels during this COVID-19 pandemic. I'm writing a new book with the working title Anti-Science Kills, where I estimate that after May 1 last year, when the president announced that anyone in the United States who wanted to get a COVID vaccine could, 200,000 Americans needlessly lost their lives because they refused to get vaccinated, because they were defiant of vaccines. And looking at the sources of it, we know where the sources are. And it's very unpleasant to talk about, because as scientists and physicians, we're not supposed to talk about Republicans and Democrats and liberals or conservatives. We're supposed to be beyond it. But it's been well documented by the Kaiser Family Foundation, the Pew Research Center, Axios, New York Times, National Public Radio, Charles Gaba, the health analyst, the list goes on. It's coming from political aggression from the far right, right? And you heard it at the CPAC conference. First, they're going to vaccinate you, then they're going to take away your guns and your Bibles. And as ridiculous as that sounds to most of us, there's a quarter of the nation that accepted it. Or vaccines are political instruments of control, or they called people who vaccinated medical brown shirts, using Nazi paramilitary analogies. And then Tucker Carlson amplified it every night on Fox News. I know, because half the time he went after me when he when he got tired of beating up on Tony Fauci. I was sort of Tony Fauci light, and he sort of, went after me. So it was amplified on Fox News, and then they cultivated a whole group of contrarian intellectuals from far-right think tanks that gave it academic cover. So this was not an accident. This was deliberate. And we don't know what to do about this because the health sector doesn't know what to do about it. And, if you look at Vivek Murthy, who I love, I think he's a wonderful Surgeon General. He talks about advisories from the social media companies. And sure, they're helping to disseminate it, but that's not driving the content. And that's where we don't know what to do because it's a political problem. And now, unfortunately, it's expanding globally. And it's gone up into Canada. And now you see those same forces from the far right are targeting low and middle income countries. And they're trying to drive down vaccination rates. So this is not an academic discussion anymore. It's a deadly force. And I'm trying to make the point that when we look at the big things that we try to put infrastructure to combat, like global terrorism or nuclear proliferation or cyber attacks, anti-science aggression is killing far more people than all of those things combined right now. And yet we don't see it as a force like that. And so I'll talk a little bit more about it on tomorrow on Thursday.
Peter, are you
probably
doing
more
a
than
book
you
signing?
wanted. What's that?
You're doing a book signing?
That's tomorrow. Tomorrow afternoon.
One thing I don't want us to lose sight of, though, is that we have had foreign actors making cyber attacks on, the European Medicines Agency, where they were looking to access dossiers of pharmaceutical companies and put out misinformation by altering the dossiers. So this isn't just, a political, it's maybe a broader political issue, that we do have foreign actors that are seeking to purposely be disruptive. And that's a bigger issue that we have to wrestle with as well, that they're enabling a lot of this for their own purposes. And that's something, and I know there's going to be a panel on cybersecurity during Aspen, and I think that's also part of this broader picture, too, that we need to be thinking about.
I think to answer your question, I think there's huge amount of data now, not only any vaccine, but even COVID vaccine, it's safe. But yes, there are rare side effects, no question about that. But it's not like putting a DNA chip in your brain or anything unusual with this, right? So I think most of us would have 3 doses. We've got 4 doses already. I think that we do know that it's safe.
Do you think if everyone had been vaccinated, the virus would be gone?
Well, that's a longer question. I think that for the beginning, you think about herd immunity, that is, people have enough immunity that you could contain this. Obviously, we're way past this stage. However, with a combination of vaccine and people having been infected, I do think there is, in fact, immunity being built. Now, we do know that some of the vaccine will not prevent transmission. But boy, if you think about Omicron and how, I bet you many of you, if you show of hands, have had infection, but not very sick, I give that credit not only to the virus, but to the fact that you've been vaccinated.
Okay. Go ahead.
Just to build quickly on that, to eradicate a virus in a human population, largely, one of the determining factors is also whether there is a non-human animal reservoir. And I think the virus that causes COVID is particularly challenging because it's such a generalist virus. It can infect everything from cats and tigers to humans, obviously, to bats, and deers. And so there is a risk here, again, of spillback, like I mentioned before, that this virus might be circulating in wildlife populations, domestic animals, and then spill back into people, or maybe not necessarily for this virus, but future viruses that emerge. We have to also think about the animal reservoir.
Okay, let me get another question here.
So last week,
Can you hang on for the mic real quick? Only because other people can hear it, and then it actually goes out on tape after this. So
last week, the members of the WTO agreed to waive for 5 years patent protection on COVID-19 vaccines and potentially in the future therapeutics and diagnostics. It'll be a future conversation. Putting aside the impact that will have on the current pandemic, how do you think, and I think you have a good range of positions on this, how do you think that might impact our ability to prepare for future pandemics?
I would say that's something that we're very concerned as a representative of the innovative biopharmaceutical industry, when it's been widely acknowledged that IP was not a barrier, and in fact IP is what has enabled us to get 13 billion doses around the globe, and we're on track for production capacity of 21 billion by the end of the year, which again is enough to vaccinate everyone who wants a vaccine. So I think we're very concerned that companies have made decades and decades of investments in infectious disease. That is in part, and quality manufacturing, and that's in part what allowed us to activate so quickly to make the progress that we did. So I'm worried about that, particularly that countries that are eligible for the IP waiver include countries that have been ones that have been responsible for cyber attacks to steal our IP. And so here now we're handing it over. But it's also the IP waiver, handing over patents is not handing over how you actually develop these vaccines and therapeutics. It's much more complicated than that. So I think we're concerned about the potential chilling effect on the existing partnerships and how this impacts future readiness.
Victor?
Well, it's a complicated issue, as you can imagine, right? I would say that, no, you do need innovation, and IP and others are ways to encourage innovation and creating, in fact, a viable business, if you will, a vibrant business. That being said, I think there are times we have to think about public good. And if it's only transitory, contained, and not precedent setting forever, I think that I would certainly say, yes, given where we are today, could have done even earlier. I know we're going to disagree with that. I have served on corporate boards, so I see the whole issue, at least from my point of view, and yes, we should protect IP, but just like everything else we deal with, when we're dealing with emergency public good, we have to find ways to, in fact, address this. But there are other mechanisms, I'm sure Anne will agree. Technology transfer without giving up the IP, right? And that could be done. Companies have said we have transfer technology without any kind of, condition whatsoever. But that obviously is more voluntary, and that could be another mechanism to make it work.
But you need qualified manufacturers. My long history is on the drug control side, so I'm worried about the proliferation of counterfeit vaccines and therapeutics and how that could actually really set us back over the longer term.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So there's no question that we need industry if one were to have this regional manufacturing, because the know-how, the training, and the tech transfer will all be needed. Aside from that, you need money to do all those things, right?
Funding again.
Funding, yes.
Okay. Any questions on this side over here? I don't want to ignore anybody over there. No. Oh, yes, sir?
You have convinced us that we know what has to be done. It involves multiple players at multiple levels and multiple continents with multiple competencies. So who's going to manage this thing? Whose KPI is, I'm going to fix this? And is it government? Is it business? We don't seem to have a leader, or we don't seem to have that one throat to choke that can bring this plan together. Can you guys comment on that, please?
I think for U.S., the AP3 plan I talked about, the 6 recommendations, mission control, which is, as you said, having someone accountable to pull that together. Right now, it is the Assistant Secretary of Preparedness, along with the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy. So at least they bring together all the pieces of CDC, NIH, et cetera, to work under the same roof to move forward. Globally, it's a really big problem, as we've talked about before. The architecture is really not well formed. I mean, there's so many different organizations. However, there are true efforts going forward, particularly with the ability to have this finance mechanism that brings people together to say, how can we actually do well? So everybody wants to be there, right, to make decisions. So there's some hope. But I agree with you, it's not easy.
Great. Anything over? Oh, you got one here? Okay.
Hi, my question is, how do we be more prepared for post-infectious sequelae from future pandemics? I say this as someone who is disabled by a virus 8 years ago myself and now work on long COVID. I think it's pretty clear we were not prepared for long COVID, so how do we do better going forward?
I think that's a great question. I think we don't fully understand, long COVID is a lot of different symptoms, and it appears differently in different people. So I think we're still trying to get our handle on what it is and what it means. But I think then that has a whole cascade of what needs to be done, right? we need to make sure that we are collecting the data. Neil, I'm going to kick it over to him to talk about the data needs that we have. But then we've got to be making sure that we provide access to care, that we're diagnosing these people, that we're providing access to care, and that we are making those long-term healthcare investments that are going to be needed to address all the forms of the health issues, because it's not just the physical health, it's a mental health, which we know is something that has been significantly impacted during the pandemic. I think many of us have felt it. And how do we address kind of long COVID collectively and holistically? But, Neil.
And to build on that is that in the past 10 years alone, we have been surprised time and time again by infectious diseases. From Ebola, who would have thought that Ebola virus could be transmitted sexually? Then Zika, who would have thought that a mosquito-borne virus would cause birth defects? Now COVID, with all of the surprises that we've seen over the last 2.5 years. And I guarantee you, disease X that emerges in the next 20 years that causes the next pandemic will be full of its own surprises, which underscores why we must also invest in preventing the emergence of these pathogens, in addition to all the other interventions we've talked about today about once that pathogen has emerged, such as emerged in humans, about how we control it through vaccines and therapeutics, et cetera. But we also need to be thinking about prevention, because these viruses will defy conventional public health and clinical wisdom all the time, sadly enough.
So we have time for one more question. Ma'am.
Why are people who have been vaccinated and been boosted still get COVID?
I mean, we talked about this. The variant, the subvariant, are able to, in fact, enter your body, if you will, and infect you. On the other hand, there is, in fact, immunity by those who are boosted, and not only in terms of antibody, but B-cell, T-cell response. So consequently, you are getting infected, but you don't get as severe symptoms. But it is possible to get transmission. So because transmission and disease, transmission is one step towards getting the disease itself, right? And the antibody, the vaccine does not seem to be able to prevent the transmission.
And one other question. How the home kits is going, don't you think they're going to affect getting good data? Because a lot of people, many people will get COVID on a home kit and not report it. And you're saying data collection is very important. So how do we deal with this?
Yeah.
Neil?
Yeah, you're underscoring a really good point about surveillance. Again, when these infectious diseases that are new first occur, diagnostic capacity tends to be limited to a select number of labs, and so all specimens get sent there, and it's much easier to count all the cases when they test positive. But we absolutely need home diagnostics, right? We need to enable the general population to have access to easy diagnostics, but then it's a double-edged sword, because now we're not counting as many cases. And then this underscores why we need to keep investing in the technologies so that the data can be reported. I have hope that as technology progresses, we will find ways for home tests to be developed so that those results can still be reported at the end of the day. So there's a variety of different things, but we need that surveillance.
Yeah, real-world data is going to be really important. And to the point made about long COVID, same thing. We need to be creating kind of the registry so that people can be, so that we can be collecting the information on their symptoms so that we can build a better picture.
So we could talk about this for about 4 days and not come to any conclusions. Unfortunately, our time is up here. But I want to thank you, Neil and Victor. Thank you so much for being here. I think this was a great conversation. And hopefully answered a few questions.